Hello, I'm Jeff Brown, and welcome to the wide world of cinema. Tonight, I walked into a theater in Texas and watched a Telugu language thriller called Drishyam 3. And somewhere during that movie, another movie started forming in my head. Not because I wanted to remake it, not because I was stealing the plot, but because cinema does something strange to people who love stories. It reproduces itself. People keep predicting the death of movies. They said television would kill cinema, then VHS, then cable, then DVDs, then piracy, then streaming, then YouTube, now TikTok, now AI. But I think people confuse delivery systems with storytelling itself. What changes is the method of transmission. The need itself never disappears. And tonight reminded me of something I think is really important. Cinema survives because cinema creates future creators. A kid watches a Western and becomes a director. Someone watches a martial arts film and becomes a stunt coordinator. Someone sees Gordon Parks and suddenly realizes Black people can stand behind the camera and tell stories through their own eyes. Someone watches Catherine Bigelow and sees war cinema differently. Someone watches Antoine Fuqua and understands violence through a different cultural lens. Someone watches Jordan Peele and realizes horror can become social allegory. None of these artists are copies of the previous generation. Mm-mm. They are responses to the previous generation. Cinema does not reproduce through cloning, it reproduces through mutation. John Ford influences Akira Kurosawa. Kurosawa influences George Lucas. Indian cinema influences Western montage rhythms, emotional maximalism, music, pacing, even the way intermissions shape narrative structure. And now, here I am, an actor and screenwriter in Texas, watching a Telugu language thriller from India and walking out with the seed of an entirely different American psychological film. That's fascinating to me because it proves cinema is no longer geographically trapped. The artistic bloodstream is global now. One film plants a narrative seed that grows differently in every viewer. And that's what happened to me tonight. I watched a story about a man constructing a false interpretation of events to protect his family. And my mind immediately started asking, what if the false interpretation wasn't misleading the audience, but was actually the final self defense mechanism of a dying consciousness? That idea became another story entirely, a ghost story, a liminal space story, a crime story, a psychological tragedy. Not because I copied the film, because the film collided with my experiences, my profession, my fears, my fascination with memory and guilt, my obsession with interpretation and narrative. And honestly, international cinema did something else for me too. It unlocked me creatively. Growing up in America, I was exposed to a very specific style of storytelling, very linear, very structured, very cause and effect. And there's nothing wrong with that. But once I started watching more international cinema, especially Indian cinema, I realized there were completely different ways to build stories, different rhythms, different emotional structures, different pacing. You have films that split themselves into acts with literal intermissions, films that reconstruct themselves halfway through, films that break acts into chapters, films that shift tone, perspective, even genre inside the same story. Sometimes it feels like instead of watching one story, you're watching five stories orbiting each other. And for me, something clicked. Because years ago, when I was trying to write screenplays in Los Angeles, I struggled heavily with writer's block. But once I realized there wasn't only one correct American way to tell a story, something opened creatively. Watching international cinema expanded my imagination structurally. It gave me permission to experiment, permission to be non-linear, permission to blend tones, permission to let stories breathe differently. And since then, I've probably experienced the most creatively productive period of my life. That matters. Because the more cultures exchange stories, the more storytelling itself evolves. Hollywood does not own storytelling. No single country does. Stories belong to humanity. And I think that's another reason cinema keeps surviving. Every culture keeps adding new rhythms, new structures, new emotional languages to the art form. The art form keeps mutating, keeps adapting, keeps reproducing itself through people. A movie enters your mind, collides with your memories and philosophy, and mutates into something new. That's one of the most beautiful things about cinema that people who only consume plot summaries and endings, explained videos completely miss. Films are not just entertainment objects, they are creative catalysts. And during intermission, I actually had a fascinating disagreement with a friend. They were talking about a television series they had been following for years, spending season after season with these characters, and I realized something about myself. At this point in my creative life, I'm drawn toward the concentrated completeness of cinema. I like sitting down and experiencing an artist's full statement in one sitting, beginning, middle, and end. Not because television can't be art, it absolutely can and often is. But right now, as an actor and screenwriter building stories myself, I find myself obsessed with compression. How do you tell something emotionally complete in 2 or 3 hours? How do you create tension, ambiguity, revelation, catharsis, tragedy, all within a single contained experience? That challenge fascinates me. Maybe that changes one day. But right now, cinema feels closer to the way I think creatively. And I think that's also why great filmmakers are almost always obsessive watchers of film. Not because they steal plots, but because cinema trains the imagination to recognize emotional architecture. You start seeing tension, misdirection, revelation, emotional rhythm, moral ambiguity, silence, pacing, atmosphere. And eventually, those structures begin recombining themselves inside you in entirely new forms. That's why I go to the movies so much. Not to escape life, to engage with it, to feed the imagination, to encounter perspectives outside my own culture, language, and experience. Because every once in a while, you sit in a dark theater watching a movie from the other side of the world and walk out carrying the beginning of another story. And maybe that's why cinema survives every prediction of its death. Because long before cameras, screens, streaming, or theaters, human beings gathered around stories. Always have.